Hey folks, and welcome to a new video. I wanted to show you a little bit more of a power user example of using GitHub Copilot Chat specifically, because we see a lot of people struggle with how to use it and get the most out of that. A lot of people just use the chat a little bit and they're not getting the value that is possible from using it. So, hence this video. What we normally see is that people use the chat and then they use very brief questions of, hey, how can you help me with this? Or explain something to me. Or maybe they even go so far as saying, hey, we have an application here. Can you help me write a Docker container for this? And those are valid use cases, definitely, but you can get so much more out of chat. And that is what I wanted to show in this video. Because as a power user, I really use chat a lot. I think I use it more than just suggestions because I can get more out of chat. I can give it longer instructions. I can be more specific. And tell it more of this is what I want to achieve and this is the order of steps that I'm thinking of doing. And then I can either let it generate entire methods for me, but even better, in my use case, I'm a DevOps consultant, so I write a lot of scripting for certain things or get a report out of something. And that is the example that I want to use for doing little things like getting scripts out of a system. This is really ideal. To show you what I mean, let's switch over to Visual Studio Code. I have nothing in my context here, so I do not have a folder open, for example. I've just got Visual Studio open, and that is it. Nothing else is happening in my environment. So I can go to the chat, and then I can start chatting with GitHub Copilot and try to see how much it can help me set up certain things. And this is an actual demo. I'm probably getting some responses back that that are not so good, so we can reiterate on that. Let's say this is the demo I usually use. I want to get metrics out of GitHub Copilot. There's a metrics API, and we use that a lot for customers, of course. And that lets you get usage statistics on an organization level out of GitHub Copilot. So we can see how many users are using it on a day-to-day basis, how many chat suggestions they get from GitHub Copilot, and things like that. So let's say I need to summarize that, get an overview, and maybe dump that in the end in something like a GitHub workflow file that can run that script on a schedule. So I'm going to build a script. That's already clear. My scripting language, if I have a say, that's my preference is PowerShell. So let's use PowerShell for that. But you can see, of course, that this works with Bash as well and Python, whatever you want to use for that. Let's start with describing what I want to do. Write a PowerShell script that calls the GitHub Copilot metrics API to load the usage information. By now, I've sort of learned that I shouldn't fix all my typos, but I still have that tendency. So let's leave the typos in there. The model that is backing GitHub Copilot has a semantic understanding, so it should get the drift of what I want to do there. Well, most of the time you see people in this stage. They are very sparse with extra information. I am already telling it I want to use a PowerShell script, for example, called the metrics API. I don't even know if GitHub Copilot knows that there's a metrics API. It's a relatively new API. So let's see what we can get out of that by sending that to GitHub Copilot. Let it generate and says, okay, but hey, there's no specific metrics API that I know. This is an issue that we see with data freshness in any large language model that is there. And it now starts to telling, well, if there's something available, the REST API or the GraphQL API, then potentially this is how I would do that. Let's skip everything that we don't need. So it tries to at least give me an example. Well, I know that the API is there. I can show that I have it open in Postman here, for example. It's not open the setup there. I can send that in for an organization. I've got it scripted as this is my ROPS test organization. So that is what we're currently calling. And we can see that we get information back like total suggestion count, total lines accepted on a day-to-day basis. This is anonymized. This is for all the users in that organization. And that's the level of information you can get out of the API. So I know the URL, you can find that in the docs, for example, and I know a little bit of what gets sent back from the API as well. So let's give that information to Copilot as well. The REST API can be called with, paste the URL in there, so organization, call the API with typos and look at the results. Still says confusion. I don't know. It's not there. Here's that API endpoint that you gave me. Seems like that is something that we can do. So here's a PowerShell script that lets you call that API so that we can get the responses back. Also says, hey, we're having a vulnerability in this piece of code, and says we have hard-coded credentials in the example. So Copilot is really trying to help you be more secure as well. And that comes from, the warning comes from this line in the code as well. So I can say insert into a new file. I can even store that, say this is, and the file name will be call API. Then my editor should also know this is PowerShell now, and I was expecting that I get a little bit better intelligence, but this is the, I should say, makeup that we can read it. But this is the basics of how we're doing. We have an API call there. It said, okay, we need to do something with an organization, so I can send in the organization, which was hard-coded to Rob's test in my example. I think it was Rob's test and not Rob test, just for good measure. And I can run that and I can start iterating on that. Let's not use a hard-coded token and share that with everybody in the world. Let's make this a $and GitHub token. Potentially that is already available because I am authenticated, otherwise I will just set it. We know that it knows that we need to call that authenticated, so we pick up headers, and this is an invoke REST method. You can see that this is already an improvement of the way that we're working with GitHub Copilot to build that script step by step for us. And I can start adding things and continuing on this and making it larger and larger. This is sort of the next step of the basics of how to use GitHub Copilot to write these kinds of things. And as I said, I could continue building up on that, but the example that I want to show is being more of a power user and knowing that all these steps will happen. As I said in the beginning, this is a relatively new API, so I know that Copilot doesn't have any information available, for example. So let's scrap this file so that we're not using it. Start a new session and show you how you would do this as a power user. It will probably take you less turns in the chat, so we can do this faster, and I can probably make this more complete. I already know how Copilot works. I give tons and tons of training on this, and I've been using that for a year and a half, sort of now. So I can probably do better than just the setting that I have. So start over and say, I'm very directive. I know what I want to have, and I'm going to add some extra instructions on top of this as well, because I want to focus on this is what I want to achieve, and these are the steps that I want to take. Write a PowerShell script. That's still the intent of what I want to do. That calls the GitHub REST API. That's helpful because then it knows how to authenticate. Add that URL. So instead of saying you should be using that one, this is the setup that I want to use. I'll clean up the variable for good measure as well. It will return JSON in the form of an array of data per day. So I'm actually giving it the information, and this is the data that you will get back. Even more helpful is then to go in and just copy that first object in there. I'll leave the breakdown out that because I know that I don't care about that right now. So now we have a JSON object. This is the array of days. It can reason about that as well. Loop over all the days and summarize the total suggestion count and the total acceptance count, and calculate the overall average percentage acceptance between the two. Then I already know that, hey, I'm still building up that prompt, as you see. I want to do this across multiple organizations because that's usually what we see at customers as well. So I can start instructing it that as well. The script will use a method with a parameter for the organization name. read a list of organizations from a text file and loop over them all. Show the summary average both for each organization and for the overall sum. So I'm being way more descriptive. I'm giving it more examples, and I'm giving it an example of this is the API we're going to get back. And I'll let Copilot do the work for me. So instead of writing the entire script myself and building that up into pieces, if you're very descriptive and you know how it works and what you can expect, you can get way more content out of that as well. Still says, please note that this script assumes that you have a text file named organizations.txt, so it's already pretty far. Let's inject that into a new file. Say that again in the same directory, demo2. And let's see what we have. We have a function, so we have a separate method in here that does get usage data for an organization. We have calling the API at the URL that I specified. It didn't automatically think of, hey, we need to authenticate there. So that is something that doesn't go correct. So this is an example of you still need to read what it is doing and potentially tweak it a little bit. There's a total suggestions and total acceptances that it is taking care of because we want to have that overall summary. So that's great for that organization. So for each day in the response, just tally them up. There's an acceptance average that is then calculated based on the total suggestions, and we give that back as a random object. Organization, total suggestion, total acceptances, average acceptance count. So this is the percentage. Great. We can see that it picks up get content from an organizations.txt. It figured out that that needs to be a txt file. We have an overall parameter or a variable to keep track of the overall suggestion score. This seems pretty usable on what I need to do. It's calling to get usage data for the organization based on the organization that it has there. Per organization, total suggestion, total acceptances. So this is pretty much everything that I need except for that authentication part. So I can now tweak it and say I need to make this call authenticated. Let's just do that. How can I authenticate? And that can be then super simple again, because I want to do something very specific. And says, well, you need a header for that with an authorization token, get this token in there. And since I've selected the response, that's being very directive, I can just override that. And we have, again, my personal access token in here. So I could say $n GitHub token again to make that a little bit more secure. And say, okay, we now have that. We can loop over the entire set of organizations. This is what I wanted to show with, hey, we can get way more out of that by thinking a little bit up front, know how GitHub Copilot uses context for certain things, and then get a result out of that as well. So with that, I think I've shown you a little bit more of an example of how I think when I'm using GitHub Copilot, and especially in the chat. I think there's definitely benefit in having that understanding of we can ask more, let it generate more as well. And this works tremendously well in my work as a DevOps consultant when I'm helping out my customer, asking these kinds of things, being very descriptive. Hey, I have this API that I want to call. I know that I get this object back. I want to do that with the information, and maybe I want to loop across organizations. That is where I see the real benefit of GitHub Copilot Chat in that scenario, in that situation. So I hope you learned something new. Definitely learn more on my blog. I share most of these videos as blog posts there as well. And otherwise, you can follow me on social media or follow my YouTube account. And I will see you next time with another explanation of how to use certain things better than you do right now. Thank you so much for being here.